This year, police reform took center stage as a policy priority for many Americans as the movement for Black lives and other social justice protests popped up in cities across the nation. And while the culture of policing is a known problem, and there are a number of causal factors influencing this problem, there are policy recommendations available to address the issue head on. After conducting continuous research on this topic for the past 4 months, I am so excited to share my findings with all of you. Today, I want to talk to all of you about the problems associated with the current culture of policing in the United States, how Las Vegas in particular is impacted by this issue, and how we can work towards improving this culture by implementing the policy recommendation of divesting from our current amount of policing. Now that I've introduced my topic, let's talk about how it's prevalent on a national scale. The culture of policing in the United States is a problem that has 3 main components: racial, social, and fiscal. The first reason that the current culture of policing is problematic is because there is a racial component to this issue. Black people are disproportionately policed at national and local levels, and this can be seen when arrest trends are considered. The Vera Institute of Justice publishes the demographic breakdowns of arrest trends across the nation, and their 2016 study shows that Black people accounted for approximately 26.8% of total national arrests. However, census estimates from 2010 show that Black people account for approximately 13.4% of the nation's population. The second reason that the current culture of policing is problematic is because there is a social component to this issue. The police are tasked with a large range of duties, but many of these issues that they handle are not related to violent crimes or proceedings that would necessarily need a police officer. In fact, Dr. Rayshawn Ray, a scholar from the Brookings Institution, found that 9 out of 10 calls for service are for nonviolent encounters. A problem arises when a variety of social issues, such as those related to mental health or homelessness, are met with the warrior mentality that many police officers are trained to have. Captain Joe Perez, in a Brookings Institution webinar, describes that a worrisome trend of heavy-handed policing can often pit officers against the communities they serve. This heavy-handed policing is dangerous for nonviolent encounters, especially those that deal with our most vulnerable community members. The third reason that this culture of policing is problematic is because there is a fiscal component to this issue. Across the nation, the funding that goes towards policing and incarceration exceeds the funding that goes towards a variety of different social service programs. Dr. Andre Perry and a team of researchers from the Brookings Institution found that state and local government expenditures for policing amount to approximately $115 billion each year. This is in comparison to approximately $100 billion spent on public health, $52 billion spent on community development, and $40 billion spent on state mental health services. $115 billion is an enormous amount of money. In fact, that's how much it would cost to fully fund the Clark County School District 46 times. This data proves that more taxpayer dollars are going towards policing and punishment than community development every single year. Now, clearly this is a national problem, but how has it impacted the Las Vegas community specifically? Well, Las Vegas is impacted in particular when the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department's current practices are considered. The LVMPD disproportionately arrests Black people at a rate that is even worse than the national average. The Vera Institute of Justice found that in 2016, Black people accounted for approximately 36.8% of the LVMPD's arrests. However, census data from 2010 shows that Black people account for approximately 13.1% of Clark County's population. Racial disparities within policing have led to a number of Black Lives Matter protests in recent years, with an increased amount of demonstrations taking place in recent months, including in Las Vegas. Daniel Rothberg and Jacob Solis from the Nevada Independent reported on a Black Lives Matter protest that filled Las Vegas Boulevard on May 30th of this year, where protesters were angry enough about systemic racism and police brutality that they were willing to risk their health in the midst of a global pandemic. The LVMPD also takes on more officer-initiated calls and calls for service than calls for violent or property crimes. At the end of every week, the LVMPD publishes a statistical activity report that details the numbers of different types of calls they respond to since the beginning of the calendar year. Between January 1st and October 31st, 2020, less than 3.2% of the total calls received by the LVMPD were calls for violent or property crimes. In comparison, approximately 96.8% of the calls they respond to were calls for service or officer-initiated calls. This encompasses a range of violent and nonviolent issues. However, the LVMPD's ID of code card details that some of these issues may be related to mental health, homelessness, sick or injured persons, and traffic control, among others. Local activists in the Valley have also advocated for some of these duties to be shifted away from police officers, expressing that social workers or mental health specialists may be better equipped to handle some of these societal issues. And finally, the city of Las Vegas and Clark County allocate the largest slice of their general budgets to policing every single year. For the fiscal year 2020-2021, the city of Las Vegas allocated approximately 25.6% of their general budget towards policing, and Clark County allocated approximately 18.4% of their general budget towards policing. The city and county are locked into allocating these large amounts of taxpayer dollars towards the LVMPD due to NRS 280.201, a state statute that establishes a funding formula for the city and county's contributions to the LVMPD based on the number that is partially dependent on the number of calls for service that the LVMPD responds to. This creates a cycle where the department responds to more calls for service, which may not be violent proceedings, in order to receive increased funding. This also puts local legislators, such as Las Vegas City Council members and Clark County commissioners, in a difficult position where they don't have the freedom to re-examine their budgetary priorities, even when community activists are begging for change. Above all else, these symptoms of a larger problem have deeply impacted Las Vegas residents on a very personal level. Las Vegas is not immune to instances of police brutality, and this past summer, local activists chanted the names of neighbors that they lost to police violence at Black Lives Matter protests in Las Vegas. Tashi Brown and Byron Williams are two Las Vegas-based names that were chanted at protests, and it was evident that emotions were running high both during and surrounding these events. Disparities within policing, including in Las Vegas, are not new. However, the rallying cry for systemic change that took center stage this year has made the issue impossible to ignore. This has put the LVMPD, elected officials, and activists in a position where they are forced to begin some difficult conversations. But one thing is clear: change is a must. This is evidently an important issue to Las Vegas community members. But what can we do next to address the issue and find a policy solution? Well, in the 2021 Nevada legislative session, Nevada legislators have the opportunity to re-examine NRS 280.201. This state statute establishes a funding formula for the city and county's contributions to the LVMPD that is partially dependent on the number of calls for service they respond to. However, as discussed earlier, not all calls for service are inherently violent proceedings that would necessarily need a police officer. With this in mind, NRS 280.201 could be amended to only mandate municipal funding for the LVMPD or metropolitan police departments in general for violent and property crime calls. Beyond that, funding practices could be determined by local legislators. As residents, we could advocate for this solution by submitting public comment to the Nevada legislature or by directly contacting our elected officials. It is important to note that an amendment to NRS 280.201 would not automatically create any major structural changes to police funding, but it would give local legislators, such as Clark County commissioners and Las Vegas City Council members, more budgetary control and freedom to divest from heavy policing with time. With this in mind, our local legislators could envision public safety by defunding the LVMPD and reinvesting some of that funding into other options and community development projects. Dr. Rachel Ray from the Brookings Institution expresses that defunding the police can be a policy solution rooted in fiscal responsibility with potential benefits that will reduce police violence and crime. Elise Schmelzer, a reporter from the Denver Post, reports that a similar example can be seen in Denver, Colorado, where a support team assistance response program was established to send a mental health specialist and paramedic to some 911 calls instead of police. Denver has seen a lot of positive results with this program, and Las Vegas could implement something similar with redirected funding. Again, we could advocate for this as individuals by submitting public comment to our local legislators or by contacting them directly. Now that we have reviewed a potential solution to this policy problem, we can start to wrap things up. In conclusion, the culture of policing is a known problem with a number of causal factors influencing this problem, but there are policy recommendations available to address the issue head on. In review, I discussed the elements of this culture of policing, how this culture impacts the Las Vegas community specifically, and how we can work towards improving this problem culture by implementing the policy recommendation of divesting from our current amount of policing and redirecting it to other social services. With this in mind, if we take into account these short and long-term solutions and work together, the future of the culture of policing may be brighter for the next generation of policy scholars and residents of Las Vegas. Thank you.